you really can't build a ground-up model from things you can actually measure. And so when somebody says, well, this is my opinion as an expert, you know, as the Romans say, cum granulo saltum, with a grain of salt. You just don't know, but you have to make decisions. And finally, I just like this. It turns out that out of this literature, which is what you would guess, right, you have this category called super spreaders. And there really was a typhoid Mary. She was a cook, duh. That's a great way to send typhoid around. Didn't wash her hands, one imagines. But there are people who turn out to be connected to lots of people in these random chains. And if the first couple of generations of the contagious disease happen to get one of those people, then that's delightful, right? The disease becomes huge. When you reach a critical mass of people, statistics takes over, law of large numbers, and it just propagates throughout the society. But in the early stages, right, if the disease hadn't run into typhoid Mary, there might not have been an epidemic that year. It just would have petered out if less social people had been infected. Now, query, right? If you're going to have a contagious weapon and you have, you know, suicide bombers, except they just want to be infected. Actually, it's kind of hard to walk around when you're contagious and have smallpox, but people often talk about, right, you could put some guy on an airliner, he could just come and hug people, right? So you could deliberately try to be a super spreader. But it's a subtle issue is what I'm saying, right? You don't know how this would go. The truth is that none of the numbers are very good. The one thing we know, but I somehow take cold comfort in it, is that every year the estimated fatalities are lower than last year. But it's not like there's a lot of new data coming in. They're just more and more elaborate models, and the models aren't terribly well justified. The best we can do. Okay. And I already said this, right, but all of these models are subject to public policy, and here it really is overwhelmingly social. Educating people, quarantining whole areas. It's incredibly socially destructive. We'll come at that next time. Before you start throwing up quarantines all over the place, you have to think very hard because it creates a whole lot of behaviors for the society that end up canceling the benefit of the quarantine. And then vaccination strategies. Ring vaccination, you find out where there's an outbreak now and you quickly focus on immunizing everybody around that area. Mass vaccinations just do the whole society indiscriminately in everybody's favor. Prophylactic, just vaccinate them before the outbreak. But these are the strategies. As I say, there's more in the book. All right. So I don't know, is this a sensible terrorist investment? Well, it depends on how easy it is to get the smallpox. Right now, supposedly, you see these dark whisperings, but supposedly smallpox exists on 2 places on the planet. It seems like that would be hard to get. Maybe genetic engineering allows you to replicate smallpox. We'll come to that before the end of the hour. Okay. If you could do it, if you could get it, you're not sure it would work any more than the defenders are sure that it would work. It would alarm both of you. But you know, terrorists presumably have some risk preference. We spend a lot of time talking about how they don't want to have anticlimactic moments. Vast plot to come up with smallpox has exactly that quality, right? It might pay off big, but it also might make you look like an idiot, which is the one fatal thing if you're a terrorist. Viruses, as I said last time, are hard to culture, so you need specialized skills for that. And then there is this question about how good would it be if you infect some guy and you send him off to infect everybody else. All right, so that's contagious diseases, other than what's in the readings. Look, it's more fun when you don't have to listen to me all the time. Well, it's more fun for me. Comments, questions before we move on? Yeah.
Along the line of the super spreaders, are big corporations that produce food, do they have high security to prevent those types of things from getting food?
Yeah. So this comes up, I mean, there's a little bit of a sidelight, but this comes up with agro-terrorism, right? So we might as well mention this now, so people always talk about, in the usual casual way, how easy agro-terrorism is. We know reasonably well that it can't be easy for the obvious reason that the Germans tried very hard to do it in the First World War. because the First World War was entirely horse-drawn. So the first thing they do is they try and infect everybody's mounts with glanders all across Europe and in the United States. There's a glanders factory in Washington, D.C., all built on the sly. And nothing much happens, right? It doesn't come out of the noise. Ken Alabek claims that he sees in the data before Stalingrad that the Russians were monkeying with biological weapons. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. And there are persistent rumors, and they're probably not rumors when you talk to people, that the Russians tried this in Afghanistan, because after all, the whole insurgency was completely horse-drawn again, right? And it's a really logical thing to do, and so what you have now is you have state programs trying to make this work. And so what's really annoying in this business, right, is you keep meeting people who have a living consulting for DHS and giving seminars for law enforcement, right, and they sit there and everything is easy, and this is clearly not true. But then you have to ask yourself, right, that's the style of this subject, at least the way I do it. You have to ask yourself, all right, fine, but maybe things are different now. And what we have, right, well, we have these bow tie systems that we talked about last time. So maybe there's more of that than there used to be, or the Germans didn't try that in the First World War, right? Everybody's getting milk from their local dairy. It's not pooled in some giant place and then disassembled again. Or maybe we have what? This factory farming world, where, the animals might have not infected each other in the old days on the farm, but now they're stacked in cages, right? And, it's not just that Greenpeace doesn't like it, but the infectivity is different. So if you think about these contagious disease models, right, you've now changed the model entirely, at least for the animal segment, right? Because now everything is stacked like that. And so the point is that what about corporations and their own health? And we'll start touching on this later in the semester, but your first reaction to this is, well, we got to regulate those guys. And your second reaction is, I don't know, the corporations know a lot better about managing their internal operations. Can we figure out some way to get them to do it to themselves? And if we could, is that a better solution? Right? So if you think about the long history of hygiene in the 20th century, everybody likes See's chocolate, right? And so they have this resolute, a couple eyes light up, right? I'll bring See's chocolate. God, it's on tape. I can't deny this. Anyway, what's the See's chocolate thing? I mean, everything is like celebrating 1936, which is not a year to celebrate, right? But why are they all dressed in white? Because when you went into a business in the early 30s, you were afraid of coming home with ptomaine poisoning. Terrible control of food. And most of the progress since then is not about government regulation, right? It's about modern management techniques and whatever ability there is to get the brand out for the whole country, and now you really learn how to police your franchises. So there's at least a hint there, right, that the corporations have solved this problem once already, and if you could get the right incentives, and maybe they have the right incentives, but if you could get the right incentives in place, you don't necessarily have to write 1,000 pages in the Federal Register and hire a new staff of inspectors. There's at least a second way to deal with that. So absolutely, when I say there's this, that the everybody has three friends model has a whole lot of actual complexity packed into that simplification, part of that is that a lot of these processes take place in the commercial world, right, where there's scale. And so when you think about interventions, one of the places you want to think about interventions is corporations, and it could indeed be, right, that things like factory farming have changed the problem so that when I come and tell you stupid stories about Afghanistan in the 80s, it really has changed. The only habit I want you to get into, right, is we should focus on what really has changed, because we sort of know this was a hard problem originally, right? Anybody who comes to you and tells you some story about throwing an infected rag over the fence at some cattle feed yard, right, in some family farm, we kind of know the system isn't unstable to that. There have been too many bad actors wandering around trying to do this experiment over the 20th century. Factory farming is different, right? So it's never attacked one of those, maybe that would be different. And then the question arises, right, Do we clean it up, or do we try and set it up so that the corporations themselves do? Who's the lowest cost enforcer, right? So we're going to get into this in more detail, but that's previewing the issues. Does that answer, or is that kind of beside your point? All right, and there was another hand. Jesse? No? Okay. All right, so that's the contagious disease point, right? Maybe contagious diseases change everything, but it's another one of those complicated stories that's not obvious. It's probably the best biological weapons story, other than anthrax, which is such an indifferent poison that it's almost not biological weapons at all. But what if you pay no attention to the rest of the biological weapons part of the course, right? There are two really great candidate weapons, and after that we're talking about exotic things that would work really, really well if they could be made to work. But the two things that are just the low-hanging fruit that work enormously better are anthrax and smallpox. And then maybe, you could talk about some other weapon. God knows the Americans weaponized lots of things, a half dozen diseases in the 1950s. So it can be done with other stuff, but the really obvious stuff for terrorists is those two diseases. I say this because if you talk to a biologist, right, and you say, well, the smallpox threat doesn't seem so great. They say, what about tularemia? And you say, well, the tularemia thing, and they say, what about, right, and it's endless. They keep, there are 100-odd organisms. But in general, right, the stars of the show, they're not all interchangeable. The stars of the show are smallpox and anthrax. And then, you're down into the weeds. You have to start trying to think about it that way, right? If each of these things is a unique threat, you can't do public policy. Okay, so that's contagious diseases. Let's talk about biotech. And the background to this, we talked last time, is that there was this huge Soviet and later Russian cheating program, maybe it's not over yet, that said, well, the West is pretending to get rid of biological weapons with this hypocritical treaty. It must be really, really good. We'll invest more. And this is the early days of biotech, 70s and 80s, but they figured out everything that companies in San Francisco knew, and they said, how can we make better biological weapons with that? So this is like a $20 billion program over that period. It's a lot of money. What were the Russians able to do? And so there's this Ken Alabek book. He's one of the defectors in the early 90s. And he says that, well, they took organisms that already existed, plague and anthrax, and they made them vaccine resistant, drug resistant. We'll hear in a minute that's pretty simple. That they engineered other organisms to make specific chemicals, in particular toxins. So the problem is if you get a fermentation vat and you want to make toxins, the organisms start poisoning themselves, so you can't get a really efficient vat. It keeps scooping off toxin, right? It produces at very low levels because it is a toxin. And you can genetically engineer organisms to produce toxins the same way Jay Kiesling engineers organisms to make artemisinin and drug precursors. So the Russians supposedly did that. That's a reasonable claim. People are forever using genetic engineering to make high quantities of almost anything, right? And then there's this sort of wild story, which is what got most of the headlines. In fairness, Alabek doesn't quite say that he knows that this is true. He says it's an inference. And people since then have made sort of a whispering campaign that Alabek isn't a very good biologist and you can't make these things in any way. Why would you? It's urban folklore. So it's a little conflicted, but he claims that he built these chimeras. There are people here who probably know more about what a chimera is than I do, but it's sort of half and half DNA, where he makes mixes of smallpox and other weapons diseases, Venezuelan equine fever, and Ebola, supposedly. So if smallpox isn't bad enough, right, let's make smallpox where the blood kind of rushes out of your skin because you're no longer, watertight. So supposedly they did this. So that's the background, and the question is, how do you put your arms around this? How do you make some kind of judgment other than, having swearing matches about whether Ken Alabek is a good biologist? Because after all, even if this is untrue, it's not obvious it couldn't be done. So what do? And you can come up with a list. This is out of the book, but you can come up with a list of things you might want to do. So the classic Soviet programs, right, are learning how to make toxins in bulk and learning how to make organisms resistant to multiple drugs. And then much more adventurously right now in recent years, people have actually made 1918 influenza from the sequence published in Nature, right? So you take this GATTAC sequence, right? You send it off to one of your friendly neighborhood synthetic biology corporations, and they send you back a vial in a FedEx pouch and a bill for $10,000, and you now have 1918 influenza. Well, not quite. You have to get it inside an organism, and the organism has to make more of the virus, but that's been done. So someone on Earth can do that, and it's presumably not very far until you can make smallpox too. Now I should say, right, this is really low-hanging fruit, because if it's exactly smallpox, one would hope, right, that any corporation would look for that on the theory that, you know, adding a line of code that compares the customer order exactly against smallpox basically costs $0. So you would like to think, right, that any corporation would look for that, but there's the more general problem, right, about that they look for everything that you would worry about. And we'll talk about that in detail in a later lecture. But in any case, there's this idea that you could get pathogens that otherwise you don't have a hope of getting. Smallpox exists in 2 places on Earth. But hey, if it's an information good, if it's not about the artifact anymore, I'll just make some. And that's not so far off. Other things you could do is you could make, you know, the problem with biological weapons, right, is people keep infecting themselves. And, you know, the nature of a lot of biotech is that, well, you take 2 things that are harmless, keep them in separate beakers, pour them together, shake well, and now routinely you would get a dangerous organism out of that. This is like in the chemical weapons world called a binary weapon, right? You want something that you just make dangerous, preferably after it emerges from the artillery tube, right? After it's been fired downrange, the stuff mixes, and now it's dangerous, but it wasn't dangerous a millisecond before because it was in 2 separate pieces. That's very natural to do with biological weapons. So you would like something that you mix it together, and only at that point does it become dangerous to humans. You might want to teach these things to evade diagnostics, so you have some tests to see if people have been exposed to Ebola, and they have, but you've engineered the Ebola so that the diagnostics don't work on your Ebola. Vaccine resistance, similar idea. You would like, ideally, to make this stuff more infectious. That's a real problem, right? Because if you talk to the biologists, it's sort of a bang-bang business, right? You can change the rate at which a cell secretes some enzyme, but fine-tuning is tough. And if you think about things like how contagious is it, how transmissible is it, well, you know, diseases that kill the victim all at once, are they very transmissible? So Ebola's like this. Why don't we all have Ebola? Yeah, they don't get to shake hands with all 3 of their friends, right? So, you know, this is like plague in the old days. You know, as I say, read Defoe. Defoe is great. You know, you wake up in the morning and you're dead before lunch. That's not your ideal weapon. But now you're going to go to a genetic engineering guy and you're going to say, you know, what I'd like is, naturally this thing takes about 3 days to kill you. And I'd like it to be a little faster, but I don't want it to be like, you know, 6 hours. All right, I got to tell you, this is completely not the state of their art. Or rather, they would make you a dozen candidate organisms and say, here, go test them in goats. Or better yet, people, because goats are always different from people, right? And you can't be sure that something that works in goats works at all in people. So it becomes difficult if you have to fine-tune things. And here you have sort of a double uncertainty. Not only does genetic engineering work in a bang-bang way, I can produce lots of this stuff, but I can't fine-tune it. But you're also trying to intervene in the social cycle, right? You don't understand that at all. If you did, you could do better epidemiology models, right? So this is like, you can try it a dozen times and hope that something works, but it's that level of cut and paste. Altering the host range, something that's normally found in animals, can you teach it to live in humans? Boy, is that tough. Increased morbidity and mortality, yeah, you can probably change that, but if you do, is that going to mess with how contagious it is? Easier propagation and distribution. There's some ability to change the outer coating of the organism so it's less vulnerable when you force it through the sprayer, but this is a really chaotic business. Can you make a weapon that modifies genes in the body? And then, I don't know any biologist who believes this, but it keeps showing up. Can you build a weapon that targets ethnic groups? The hysterical thing is that, they always pick the hardest one, right? It's like, how different are the Israelis genetically from the Arabs? I mean, they're all Semitic peoples. But in any case, ethnicity, as people always tell you at Cal, right, is a construct. There's very little genetic basis for it. So could you make a weapon that discriminates that way? Anyway, that's the kind of thing that people are always bringing up. Okay, so those are sort of the things that you see in the literature. The easy ones, or the ones that are sort of current state of the art, are up here. So we start with those. Making toxins, right? Organisms make you sick because they secrete toxins, but if you could just secrete the toxin in a vat, then you've got this really cool poison that's better than any nerve agent. Can you make these things resistant to drugs without making them weak along other dimensions? That was the problem with the Russian anthrax program. For years, they tried to make it simultaneously resistant to 3 drug treatments, but every time they got to the 3rd one, the first 2 disappeared, right? And then finally they made that work. That was the 80s, maybe we can do better. Bringing these guys back to life and these binary weapons idea. So if you did these more or less easy projects, what happens is that you're not adding too much new DNA, and maybe, right, if you don't add much DNA, then you don't have this pleiotropy problem that when you shove in new DNA, old DNA suddenly doesn't work. And so maybe you wouldn't need so much animal testing. I think the argument that you have to make about genetically engineered weapons is that they're addressing the wrong part of the problem. The expensive part of the problem for biological weapons has never been getting a new organism, right? You could do that with classical biology methods. The British made better anthrax by running it through monkeys, and whichever monkey got sick fastest, they ran that blood through yet another monkey, and you can do these things in very classical methods. Genetic engineering helps that a lot, but really that's not like then seeing if this thing still survives in the environment, and if it's stable on the shelf and all those other things. That's still this big testing program stuff. So there's a sense in which maybe genetic engineering isn't helping you with the best part of the problem. But even these sort of easy projects, require fairly non-trivial skills. People are always saying that high school students will do that. It's really enlightening to talk to genetic engineering companies who have high school students come in as interns. And, they don't, it's true that the high school student can do it, but it's like every 1000th time. It takes a while to develop those skills. And, there's this question about pleiotropy. If you confer drug resistance, maybe it's not as hardy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the point has been made in the past that you don't really care about drug resistance if you have a weapon that can infect all of Los Angeles. In the old days, at least, not quite true today, but probably still true. If you can infect things on a large enough level, it doesn't matter that you have vaccines, right? It's just going to overwhelm the public health authorities, so why would you bother? If you could do the rest of it, you don't worry about making it resistant to drugs. All right, so those are the things that are sort of easy, and by exclusion, these are the things that are harder. What do you say about them? And this is this point that I made before about, that genetic engineering is a very bang business. So suppose you wanted to engineer organisms so that they were transmitted more easily from person to person. That's a logical weaponeer thing to do. So it turns out, right, that the skin is really good protection. This is why everything is always about inhaled weapons, right? The skin is remarkably good at excluding nasty stuff. But, there are sort of chemical tricks that microbes have used since the beginning of time to get through the skin barrier. And they secrete various materials. God only knows what they are. These are the words: proteinases, phospholipases, and then enzymes, once they're in the body, to break down the stuff that would otherwise kill them in the blood. You can do that, but this is again sort of a delicate business, and you would want the right levels of these things. And it's much less clear, right, that you can do that and still have a hardy organism and make this thing work. So you can do this in principle, but it becomes quickly very complicated, and, you know, how possible is it? All right, so that's what I have to say about genetic engineering, and let me take a couple of questions to the limits of my ability to talk about it, then we'll round out this segment and take our break. Questions, comments? I tell you, the whole subject in the streets, right, is that people are going to use this genetic engineering to kill us all. So you should have like strong opinions about this, right? This is the way that people advertise that WMD makes sense. I bring this in at the end because it really is just a little curlicue on the basic story about biological weapons WMD. But it's the important part of the topic, because when you have this argument in life about whether biological weapons will kill us all, the answer you get is, oh yeah, but that was before genetic engineering, and these guys can do anything, right? And after all, Wall Street in some sense believes they can do anything. It might be true. Comments?
In assessing, I guess, whether a weapon will be transmissible, like in a more effective way or more contagious, how does like sensitivity issues come into play with that? Like, because some people might be more sensitive than others and might be more prepared or equipped.
It's a long, complicated string. It has to get into the bloodstream, and you know, what do you want to do? Do you want it to stop secreting this stuff after it gets across the barrier and is going to produce so much that it more than it needs, and therefore it's like weakening itself because it's spending a lot of energy to do this? So you've got some complicated biological story about how it's going to get past all the barriers, and then you want to get exactly the amounts of this stuff that you need and no more, and it becomes, since we can't control those things that way at all, it becomes quickly let's try this 100 times. And then you're back in this world of, is this engineering at all? Why don't you just send this through 14 monkeys? Right, which is sort of the traditional classical microbiology way of doing this. Yeah, so the thing that's hard to verbalize for this, and God knows I'm not a biologist, but that's the thing that's hard to verbalize always, and the thing that's interesting in this problem is, why would it be hard? And so, you know, what I have to say about that's in the book. But that's the level at which I've done this. I actually think that there's like plenty of work, really useful stuff that biologists could do about fleshing out whether this is hard, because it should be an open question, right? Just because I'm skeptical doesn't mean it would be true. But that's something that, right, that's a place where you really want to be able to do this skill of reading science with a social scientist's eye. What's sort of robustly true, what's hard about this, what's easy about it, right? So I'm trying to give you a flavor of that, but that's the best I can do. Okay. All right, so that's traditional genetic engineering, but we have other stuff at Cal, right, that's new and improved, and you know, if you don't like a genetic engineering story, well, we have another story. So the last part of this bioweapons lecture is about what are the new things, and it's a blatant setup for synthetic biology, because you know, I've been involved in that, and anyway, it's interesting, it's at the head of all the bioweapons discussions. So we'll do a lot more policy with synthetic biology, but I'll at least introduce it at this point. Okay. So the thing that people have been talking about forever, well, since the 1990s, are these so-called bioregulators or biomodulators. And what are they? Damned if I know. They're the usual definition of a drug or poison. They are things that in tiny, tiny, tiny amounts have some large effect, give you cancer, stop you from having cancer, change things in the body with tiny provocation. And this was a hot topic in the drug development business in the middle 1990s. And so inevitably, right, in the way that these stories go, it becomes a hot topic in the biological weapons literature. If you can use these things to do massive interventions in the body with hardly any material, well, that's the goal of all biological weapons. Even less mass than you would need for, you know, delivering a few organisms to the victim. Maybe you can just deliver a whiff, a couple of molecules of this bioregulator, and that will you know, make everybody sick. So, you know, the only thing I want to notice about this, other than it's 20 years later and they still talk about it, but they don't talk about it in the present tense, that's the level at which I understand this, is, you know, we have the same story we had about chemical weapons, that to the extent that this subject advances at all, it advances because there's, in anticipation, commercial money if these things can be made into treatments, and that gives you the opportunity, maybe it's a lousy opportunity, but it gives you the opportunity in principle to just stop it entirely. If you wanted to make, and I will screw this up, but research into erythropoietines, if you wanted to make research into that illegal, it's plausible that you could have a treaty. You might be able to do things even more brute force than that, given the, you know, the drug companies sell to the American market. Maybe if the Pentagon really leans on them, they would just stop doing this research. And if that were true, right, that would be the end of the story. So you have the possibility of power, right? You don't have this technological inevitability. It might be terrible, right? Because, you know, the pharmaceutical companies are sort of doing a good thing, and if we think that pesticides retroactively was a good bet despite nerve gas, then this is an even better argument, right? Or it sounds like a better argument. So we might not want to do that, but we should realize that we have some influence over the development of these things. And then the other thing is that even if you have the science about how one of these things can be made into a drug and or a weapon, because the pathways in the body are pretty similar, you know, you would still have to learn how to produce this stuff in bulk, and that's what the drug companies have been really good at for the last 100 years. Taking something like penicillin, which starts off as basically impossible to make in any quantity, and learning how to scale it up so that it's done in vats and vats and vats. That's commercial activity with a vengeance. Every year, you can make more of this stuff in the same size vat. Okay, so that's that, and let's finish off with synthetic biology. So, I know I've said a little bit about this. From time to time, it's a big Berkeley specialty, a lot of grant money coming to Berkeley on synthetic biology. This is a little bit like Nixon's war on cancer in the 70s. You all don't remember that, but Nixon declared war on cancer. He also declared war on drugs. It's sort of working out at about the same level. But, you know, what happened after Nixon declared war on cancer? Well, every grant to the NIH was suddenly about cancer research. Although the research in the grants was not very different than before, right? Once you announce a war on something, well, we all write grants and hope, and, you know, I want to do this project, but suddenly I'm going to use the word cancer 9 times. Sounds logical. Scientists are not stupid. And synthetic biology is a little like that. In the last 10 or 15 years, right, you want to call everything synthetic biology because the Department of Energy has little conferences where they decide it's very important that we allocate $2 billion to spend on synthetic biology over the next decade. And anybody who's watching the news says, I want me some of that. And so everything becomes synthetic biology, and it's a little hard to know what the definition is, but I've spent a lot of time, because I'm a lawyer and definitions obsess me, I've spent a lot of time saying to, you know, trying to figure out what the commonality here is. A very useful commonality is that whatever the experiment is, it uses DNA that was not extracted from some organism. The old genetic engineering is about cutting and pasting DNA from one organism to another. And synthetic biology starts actually in the late 70s, you know, with things like chemical engineering on the surface of glass beads, and you make like one DNA pair, and then you dip it into, you know, a second pipette with some other DNA pair in there, and eventually you learn how to string, 5 DNA pairs in order, right? And then, of course, you can reproduce DNA like crazy. There are natural processes that do that. But the point is, that synthetic biology is this long chain of people year after year trying to figure out how to make longer and longer strands of DNA that did not come from a living animal. It comes from sugar cane or oil or anything that contains carbon, but you're starting off from nothing. This is not descended from God or evolution. You're just making this from scratch. And so what does that do for you if you can now use artificial DNA instead of cutting and pasting? Well, the obvious thing, of course, is that if you want smallpox DNA, it's kind of hard to get. Or if you want DNA that's never existed in an organism, right? That's kind of hard to get, but you can order it now and have it manufactured. And this opens new science. So what can you do with this? Well, you know, the Silicon Valley motto about bringing computing power to the masses, suddenly building, you know, it used to be that if you wanted to build some genetically engineered organism, there were 8 separate steps, and you inserted this, and then you saw if you'd done it correctly, and you inserted another thing, and you kept doing that, and 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later, you have an organism with the DNA that you set out to do. Well, hell, I'll just get my credit card out and get the DNA in the first place, right? So it makes a lot of stuff easier, and in fact, the drug companies now do a lot more genetic engineering than they used to, because you don't have to have some tech worker, right, sitting doing these difficult experiments. You can just order it. And cheap is, what is it, Lenin said that quantity has a quality all its own, right? That if you can do things in bulk because it's cheap suddenly, right? That's the qualitative change. Even if you're just doing the same stuff, it's much cheaper to do it. That's alarming. You know, things have changed. And if you're this dangerous high school student that we always invoke, right? Well, for sure, you need less skill to get out your credit card and get the DNA. It's not clear until once you get the DNA, you can use it to make smallpox, right? There are a lot of specialized skills that don't involve cutting and pasting DNA, but at least there's one chain in this thing that's a lot easier. And then you can do things that are much more ambitious. This is Lenin's point, right? That if you're going to do something that replaces 30 different large segments of DNA, there's no chance that'll work in the first time. So in the old world, if you were cutting and pasting from organisms, you'd have to try cutting and pasting at 3 weeks a shot, and you'd have to do it 100 times, and you're not going to do that. It's impossible. There isn't enough money in NIH's budget for that. But if you could just send away for the DNA, right, you can start doing things that you would never